Welcome back to Amplified. Washington, D.C. has long been known as Chocolate City for its large black population, and the region is also home to one of the wealthiest black populations in the country. But despite all the black prosperity in and around D.C., a new report finds that the racial wealth gap in the nation's capital is actually among the worst in the country and mirrors national trends. A 2019 survey of consumer finances examining the U.S. wealth gap found that overall, Black and Hispanic households hold only 2.9% and 2.8% of wealth, respectively, while accounting for 15.6 and 10.9% of the U.S. population, reflecting the fact that wealth is disproportionately skewed towards white households. And a new report commissioned by the District of Columbia examines just how significant this issue is in the nation's capital and what needs to be done to change it. The D.C. Council Office of Racial Equity, or CORE, teamed up with MITRE Corporation to show the role that race plays in the distribution of wealth. With me to discuss is Dr. Brian McClure, the Director of D.C. CORE. He joins us now with more on the group's new research. Brian, welcome to Amplified. I have to say that it is really exciting for me to see the city government, really taking a step to do this research and understand the causes of the wealth gap so that then we can figure out how we're going to find some policy solutions to bridge that gap. I would love for you to start off by just sharing some of the top lines of the findings from the report and why you even decided to do this research.
Yeah, and first, thank you so much for having me. Like you said, what we found is many of the racial disparities in the District of Columbia are deep and they are persistent. One of the top findings that we echo in our report is that white residents in the District of Columbia have 81 times the wealth of Black residents. And that's 81 times the wealth. And so we continue to hear that number and we began to ask the question, why? And one of the alarming things that we found is that there was not one major cause leading to this deep and persistent disparity. And so as we began to look at the root causes, what we found was honestly alarming. We found that there was a very interconnected, polarizing system at play. And so what we try to do in this report is break down some of the categories and what we call factors contributing to these deep and persistent disparities. And so some of the things that we found, whether it's employment, for example, in DC, we see that in Ward 3, which is a white and affluent neighborhood, the unemployment rate is only 4%. In Ward 8, which is a predominantly Black community, you have 23% unemployment rates. And whether you're looking at the rates of small business ownership, whether you're looking at the rates of how your home is likely to be valued or devalued, whether you are more likely to live in a food desert, these are all things that evolve and revolve around the racial wealth gap.
I want to get into those, what I still call social determinants. I know that there's a lot of language for the various economic and social indicators that feed into people's conditions in our society. Certainly, they are all skewed by race, but it is so much deeper than having a conversation that just says, oh, there's a racial wealth gap or there's a gap in the distribution of assets in America. It's not as simple as it's just race, but in fact, each one of these issues has a disparate impact based upon race. So I want to get into that a little bit. You just mentioned something we have talked about quite a bit on the show, which is real estate property valuations or just home ownership or lack thereof in general, right, as a way of building wealth. Speak to that in terms of D.C., because I have to say I lived there for over 20 years, and one of the things that D.C. always marveled in is that in and around, and I want to emphasize the around because the suburbs suburbs are in other states, not the District of Columbia, there seems to be more black home ownership, more black wealth than on average, but still the racial wealth gap is really bad here. So could you speak to the real estate ownership aspect and how it plays in here?
Exactly. So one of the things we found in the report is, like you mentioned, DC, Black residents in DC are likelier to have higher ownership rates than many other Black families throughout the country. The problem is that even still, Black owned homes in DC are typically valued at half of white residents in the district. And that's for a number of reasons. And I know one of the guests that you've had on was Andre Perry, whose work talks at length about that. But that presents unintended consequences and ripple effects. And one of the things that we talk about is reinforcing loops that reinforce negative outcomes that slow the creation of wealth for Black residents. So even if you are like more likelier to own a home in DC, you are still likely to live in a food desert. You are less likely to be able to afford a home anywhere in the city. And even the many of the trends that we see in DC, those Black residents who are owning their homes are purchasing homes. I don't want to say east of the river, but in Ward 7 and 8, which are predominantly Black communities. And so even what you see is a concentration of Black residents, or how some have described it as a further concentration of racial segregation. And again,
Mm.
in many of these communities, you end up having less access to easy transportation, which means that you'll have a harder time getting to jobs, which you have a harder time in Ward 8, for example. Although Ward 8 has the highest number of children, it also has the least number of childcare options and affordable childcare options. And so, what we see is that even things like real estate has resounding effects on wealth and how it's created, and how poverty or the lack of wealth is reinforced.
Everything that you are talking about right now sounds to me like Build Back Better. At least the needs. You're talking about access to childcare. You're talking about food deserts. You're talking about employment. You're talking about transportation, right? Like all of this really was about a transportation bill and thinking about social capital, right? And human capital, if you will. I'm curious, as the head of the DC kind of government agency who has commissioned this research and is really thinking this through, talk to us about the policy prescriptions that now you are recommending to try to address some of these root causes to ultimately get us to a place where we're bridging the gap.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you so much for that question. And so, one of the things we found that is pivotal is that we have to apply what we call a racial equity lens to examine how laws, policies reinforce racial inequities. And so, my office, and so excited to have what I think is the best team in DC government. Shouts out to the core team members. But we conduct what we call racial equity impact assessments. These assessments ask a simple question: who will be harmed and who benefits from this particular policy? And so, to the district's credit, we have gone through great lengths to ensure that policies, that processes, which is also equally important, and these outcomes do not perpetuate disparate outcomes. And one of the things that we've seen is when we incorporate and embed racial equity from the beginning, the what should happen on the back end is that we see more positive outcomes, and these gaps that we're talking about begin to narrow.
We just had up on the screen a chart of your feedback loops there, which talk about investing in these various buckets in order to try to get to outcomes. Here we are investing in employment, building resilience, increasing rates of return. And I have about 60 seconds with you. I'm just curious how it's going in D.C. How is the D.C. City Council doing in applying your theory of change, if you will, to the policy landscape there, as well as to the practices administratively, like you mentioned?
Right. And so we've already begun to see council members really take this work serious. and begin to look towards how can we take a more coordinated effort and build coordinated strategies to address these long-term problems. And so we've seen more innovative programs such as a pilot universal basic income program or a baby bonds program that will be the first of its kind here in the District of Columbia. So one of the things that I just want to reinforce is that I like to equate this racial wealth gap to a many-headed hydra. That if you cut off one of the heads, another one will grow back. And so, although we may have one great policy, if there is not a sustained effort, then you will see the inequities reinforce itself. And so, we have to have a coordinated strategy in housing, employment, and small business participation, so that we can see the sustained changes in the long term.
Dr. Brian McClure, the director for the D.C. Council Office of Racial Equity. You guys are creating quite the model there that can be duplicated around the country, I'm sure. We'll continue to follow the success of your work. Thank you for coming on and breaking it down for us. Appreciate it.